Hello and welcome back to Coinscrum Markets. I'm delighted to be joined today by Imran Khan, who's a partner at VC firm Vault Capital, but also has led the launch of the DeFi Alliance here in Europe. Hi, Imran.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. And also joining us, we have Ajit Tripathi, Head of Institutional Business at Aave. Thanks for joining us too.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting us.
Absolutely. So before we go in and talk about the DeFi Alliance, as you've set it up here in Europe, maybe just talk about its history, how it came about, because as I understand it, it first launched from a group of firms, or was launched by a group of firms based down in Chicago. Imran, maybe you just want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the DeFi Alliance launched in March of 2020, and it was launched at probably the start of just the DeFi summer. And one of the reasons why it started was many of the DeFi protocols we were working with were looking to tap institutional liquidity or market makers. That was one area that many institutions were not looking into. And a part of launching this was to help educate large institutions about what the power of DeFi can bring to the world of finance. So that's number one. Number two is making sure that we kind of bridge the gap between DeFi protocols being able to connect with the market makers and trading firms to get product feedback and regulatory support as well. And then finally, it's to connect the community members together as well. So obviously like DeFi protocols, you're one, bringing in liquidity, two, you're building new interesting products, but it's also about building products with the community. And so we bridge the gap between that as well. So those are like the three areas why we launched the DeFi Alliance.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're all very excited about the possibilities of what these new technologies can do. We were waiting long enough for the institutional guys to come in and just start trading and buying Bitcoin. So now they're here. It's like, okay, they're obviously very interested in what is going on technology-wise, but we're dealing with quite often highly regulated firms with lots of responsibilities for client money, and it is still very much the early days. Ajit, maybe from your perspective, you've joined Aave for that very reason, to help engage with institutional clients, which probably wasn't particularly in the team's mind at the very beginning when they started developing Aave. What's your take on that, and what, in terms of your conversations with the institutional clients, where are they in the kind of this cycle? Are they just curious, or are they actually interested in looking at the kind of various opportunities?
So I mean, I think Stani and Jordan and the team have always had that long horizon vision that DeFi is for everyone, and it's not individuals or institutions or anything. It's literally for everyone, right? And what we're trying to do is build a new architecture for financial services. We are engineers, we're not, and we're building these open protocols and ecosystems. But ultimately, we're trying to do is create a transparent and automated infrastructure for financial services on the internet, right? So the internet has kind of, taken over every other industry, but it's kind of left financial services behind. We still, are making decisions using paper behind closed walls, and there is almost no transparency. And as a little, we spend a lot of time on paperwork. We spend a lot of time, on creating new rules every time old rules don't work. And we've added up such a stack of rules that, all that leads to is, things don't seem to go wrong for a while, and then things suddenly blow up, like Archegos, like LTCM, like, UK PPI, and so on. So we're trying to create this open, transparent infrastructure. And it's being done by developers, right? So DeFi is DevFi, and Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world. Sorry, I have many concepts here, but the key idea is that the internet is taking over everything, and financial services also need to be, the infrastructure needs to be networked. Now institutions will participate in it, individuals will participate in it, and everyone will participate in it, right? So that's always been there. And if you looked at centralized crypto lending recently, then some of the it's been, the yields in centralized crypto lending, again, have no transparency as to how those are delivered. And recently they've started to disappear with the grayscale trade and so on and so forth. And the institutional interest in DeFi is enormous. So I don't actually do a lot of outbound, right? I don't go out and say, hey, we should talk. I get a lot of inbound on LinkedIn and everywhere else, and they want to know how Aave works, why Aave is now 19 billion in liquidity, what's going on with Uniswap, what's going on with DeFi. And a lot of my role is essentially education and just helping users understand, whether institutions or individuals and or other protocols, why DeFi is just a better way of building for the future.
Yeah, I mean, if we look back, and I think just looking at where the importance of these types of bodies and associations or alliances, especially now. I mean, if you go back a few years, with the origins of Bitcoin and even early days of Ethereum, I guess it was very developer centric, and whether those early developers working on those projects had the experience from traditional financial markets was sort of an open question. Quite often they didn't, and maybe you could argue it wasn't necessary then. And even back then, just raise the idea of like regulation around Bitcoin or something, and you'd have been hounded off of Reddit, hounded out of town. But I think people now building these systems recognize, like, okay, if these are going to be widely adopted and really useful, we need to consider, the real world existing regulations, hopefully using technology to bring down some of this very onerous regulatory frameworks that everyone has to comply with, and a huge cost in traditional markets. So one of the other things, Imran, that the organization and the Alliance is doing is obviously being there to mentor many of these projects. And you have an Accelerator program as well, as I understand it. Can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe give some examples of how you have helped some of these projects, maybe where there was distinct misunderstanding or lack of understanding from the project's perspective, and what you've been able to bring to them and help educate them with?
Yeah, so typically our program lasts about 6 weeks long, and within that 6-week time frame, what we hope to accomplish is being able to break down the barriers to learning about the mental models of how market makers and trading firms think about DeFi protocols and how they get onboarded. So what we do between the market makers and DeFi protocols is start to engage them pretty actively. And between that interaction between the two, there's a lot of educational nuances that they get to learn. So number one is when a DeFi protocol connects with the market maker, they think that that's the end goal. It's typically it's actually pretty interesting to see that unfold. So an example of this is when you do the entry interview in our program. Some of the protocols will say, "Oh, just connect us with the market maker," and I think the rest is history, right? Like, we can onboard them as a liquidity provider, and we can work on collaborating. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that market makers, I wouldn't say all, but most market makers that are doing billions in volume on traditional exchanges aren't going to get on board to DeFi protocols right away, right? There's an opportunity, one, to understand and learn more about what the protocol has done in the past, over the past couple of years, right? I mean, like, there's a smart contract risk that market makers think about. Number two is understanding like the KYC, AML type opportunities, right? So like, there's a lot of liquidity that are in DeFi protocols, and they want to make sure that the way they're running their operations and how they're bringing users onto their platforms is the correct way. And then three, I would say, is the types of opportunities that market makers can participate in DeFi. There's several. One is like bringing liquidity onto, let's say, a liquidity mining program. Two is being an active trader on a protocol like DYDX. And then three, there's other ways to provide liquidity that's more active versus passive. And so there's, I would say, those are like the three overarching ways where market makers can be active on some of these DeFi protocols. But ultimately it comes down to areas of expertise, and then obviously long term, where is the entire DeFi space going from a regulatory standpoint. So, and we can touch on a little bit more of those later, but yeah, that's kind of a high level there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the obvious place to start. Any marketplace needs liquidity first and foremost to be successful. And I guess if we're looking at this broad term institutional, these market making firms are quite often private companies, quite often trading their own money. It's probably relatively easy to engage with them compared to maybe going a few steps up the ladder and thinking about engaging directly with kind of, major investment banks, which I guess is the hope somewhere down the line. We're probably not there yet. Ajit, as given that you obviously need to be thinking about all these things of where you need to get a platform such as Aave 2 in the future. And I think we've seen a little bit of this of people recognizing that, look, regulations are going to be there. We've seen lots of conversation around the travel rule recently and how companies have come together to work together to try and address some of these problems. What is it that you think is most critical for projects developing DeFi solutions to be focusing on next, Ajit?
Yeah, let me start with a slightly philosophical answer and then get very concrete very quickly, right? So, I mean, in 1999, Netflix were talking about, streaming videos on the internet. And at that time, you couldn't watch anything half decent without buffering, right? And since then, we've come a long way, and it took until 2010 for Netflix to really stream at scale. Right. So I think in terms of setting expectations on how long something as transformative as DeFi takes, it can take a bit longer than we would like, because right now, if you look at DeFi, it's 120 billion plus in market cap. And US equities are 15 trillion. So I think DeFi is now big enough to be important and, to be a factor in the thinking of policymakers. But it's not big, so big that it creates any new risks for the financial system. In fact, it creates a lot of opportunities right now, without creating many new risks. Now, on the institutional front, so there are a couple of things that are going to happen. The first is that how we define institutions, right, is going to change. So if you've seen the Wyoming DAO law, and I spend a lot of time with regulators, policymakers, and lawyers. They're my favorite people. The Wyoming DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization law sets the first time in history, it sets a firm legal basis for a DAO to be a limited liability entity, right? And that sort of legal basis is kind of primary. Because when you think about, who is the operator of a decentralized service, of a DeFi protocol, it's not the tech company that built it, right? It's not any of the participants. So who is it? And, how do you sort of define controls around that? So that's the first topic. The second topic is, so there's a lot of regulation we cannot treat regulation as a constant, right? So what happens is that technology starts, then markets follow, right? So NFTs weren't anywhere some time back. CryptoKitties were such an exotic pursuit, and now eBay is selling NFTs. How quickly did that happen? So markets follow when technology creates opportunities, and then law comes around, right? So it's always developers / engineers, salespeople like me and others, and then you get the lawyers at the end to sort of really put that all together neatly into frameworks that work for everybody. So I think regulation will also evolve as technology like DeFi, creates new possibilities. And part of what we're trying to do is, also work with policymakers to sort of evolve these new frameworks and new ways of thinking about decentralized organizations, and how, who is responsible for what, and how do things work. So I think those two things are really, really critical. And then the third part is, DeFi is on the internet. The internet is global. How do you sort of do things when they are truly cross-border? And that's stable coins are cross-border, DeFi protocols are cross-border. So addressing some of these three critical factors is quite important for the speed of scaling of DeFi from where we are at 120 billion. And I know, and as you might have noticed, I'm not mentioning technology at all, because I know that the quality of engineers we are working with and that are out in the ecosystem right now, all of that is going to happen, right? That's the least of my worries. Engineers will figure it out. So so on our side, I think in terms of institutional and web scale, these are the basic, foundational blocks that our GC Rebecca and I spend a lot of time on.
Yeah. Taking what's obviously a few lessons that have been learned over the last year or more when the Alliance launched over in the US, and now set up the chapter in Europe. I noticed that chapter's been set up in China as well. Obviously, Ajit alluded to there, this is a global network. We're building on a global network anyway, so it's going to be a global problem or global problems to tackle. And we all know the challenges of that, of tackling regulations on a global basis is not an easy one. Where are you at in terms of how many chapters you've currently rolled out? Obviously, the plan is to get far-reaching as possible. And what is the plan to coordinate this advocacy at the right level to be able to affect it globally?
Yeah, in terms of the the future chapter launches, it's primarily driven by the folks in the region, and that I would say that's like number one, and then number two, it's where innovation is coming from as well, and founders, and I'd say that's primarily like two areas where we look at before we launch chapters. And the reason why we do that is because, as you mentioned, as Ajit mentioned, DeFi protocols aren't similar to products that are built by traditional startups. If you look at direct-to-consumer enterprise startups, they build for their localized regions, and then they slowly grow outside of that. DeFi protocols aren't tackling just their local consumers, but they're tackling a global audience. And what best way to learn their global audience by learning about the different chapters within the Accelerator program. And that's one of the reasons why we launched this, is to bridge the gap in terms of information, and being able to build a product quickly at scale and learn an audience over a 6-week period, or learn more about your audience over a 6-week period. So that's like number one. Number two is, interestingly, although DeFi as a sector is growing quickly, being able to find other founders that are building locally is also kind of hard to do, aside from like Twitter, Telegram, and things like that. So within our program as well, what we hope to accomplish here is to connect DeFi startups that are looking to build in these regions with localized support and regulatory support on top of that. In that way, they're able to quickly scale up, build a product that they're looking to build, but then also have a network to get a tighter feedback loop so they can have a faster product rollout. And then ultimately, the final, if you look at it from a final perspective here, institutions are starting to come into DeFi, right? And many of the DeFi many of the large institutions that are coming to DeFi appreciate a local network. It gives them a faster scale. One, two is validation. A lot of the industry, especially from a traditional standpoint, is to have validation in terms of others that are participating in the space and being able to connect and learn and kind of build. So this is, as you can tell, like a lot of what we're doing right now is onboarding and making sure we scale. Mm-hmm. So that our goal within the DeFi Alliance, our mission is to get to 1 billion users in DeFi by 2025. And in order for us to do that, we need to connect, scale, and then be able to kind of proliferate over time.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense. I mean, Ajit, Aave is one of the, as we all know, there's an explosion of experimentation and innovation going on, especially in the last 6 to 9 months. Lots of new projects materializing, coming into the market, but then projects such as Aave and a few others that we could name have really kind of become quite central to the whole ecosystem, dominant actors. And I think they probably have a lot to teach these new projects and knowledge share as well. What do you think that's going to look like? How important is it for projects such as Aave to really make sure that a lot of their knowledge is shared across the industry so it's mutually beneficial? And what are you doing around that?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the main reasons we participated in DeFi Alliance from the beginning, and our experience has been very, very positive, right? So Stani, I think, has always had the foresight to see the value of community. If you've seen, there are now other communities that have sort of modeled themselves after DeFi Alliance. And that's quite exciting as well, right? I think community is everything, and that community creates opportunities for sharing of ideas, for learning. I mean, it's a space of continuous innovation. Aave, as a team, we have learned a lot along the way from the experiments and things we built. So we share that quite a lot, right? So in terms of security, in terms of interacting with institutions, interacting, so some of the work we've done on branding, some of the work we've done on, engaging with the different parts of society and then making the user experience very smooth. So I think all of those things we do share quite actively, and Aave is in a as a liquidity protocol, Aave is also in the fortunate position where a lot of DeFi protocols interact with it, right? And that creates a natural opportunity for people to ask questions, for people to come up with new ideas. And there are lots of different protocols that are building on top of Aave code base and Aave liquidity. So we get a lot of inbound questions on how do we do that, how do we do this, and we learn, right? So it's not that Aave has a lot to share with the rest of DeFi. In fact, if you look at some of the innovation that has come in since, right, there is just an enormous this permissionless innovation, as Mark Andreessen calls it. It creates so many new ideas, and we learn a lot from the rest of the DeFi community. Now let me just lay out one very clear thing, right? So the Aave protocol is was initially launched by a team, but now, I mean, now we have a grants DAO, we have, developers contributing to Aave from every part of the world. So this type of permissionless innovation is what we're trying to create. Mm-hmm. And DeFi Alliance is a great forum for, anyone to, let's say, approach Stani or anyone to ask a very concrete question for the rest of the team. And we find it extremely useful in sort of that continuous, interchange of ideas.
Yeah. Just before we relatively short on time here, but just now that you've set up and established in Europe, and as we know, the regulators they move a little bit somewhat slower than some of the technology being innovated, but they are getting a good handle on it in general, especially if you look back compared to 2 or 3 years ago. And you've got great organisations like inaccessible tackling these issues in Europe, and Crypto UK here in the UK. With this being a more recent phenomenon, Ajit, how receptive are the regulators being when you are kind of pushing the advocacy side?
Yeah. So I mean, it's more education and learning from each other, right? So advocacy is not that I think a lot of people think of advocacy as lobbying, and I mean that's not what we do at all. What we do is we inform and educate, and we learn, right? So we learn on both sides. And then we come up with ideas as to how things can be done in a better way. So by now, I think we have spoken to every major regulator, and if you've seen Brian Brooks, Hester Peirce, and various other regulators, they're very, very excited in a positive way about the potential of what DeFi can do in achieving the principles and objectives of regulation. Now, the principles and objectives are one side. And then there is the actual formulation mechanics and the paperwork, right? So how regulation is implemented today is different from where regulation is trying to do. So regulation built on old technology is obviously paper-based. You have armies of auditors and armies of lawyers and all that, and it's really inefficient, right? Regulation is a huge cost on financial system, and eventually the users pay for it. So DeFi, with its automation, efficiency, and transparency, can actually achieve the same objectives in the long run that regulators are anyways trying to achieve, and there are a lot of regulators who see that. Now, realizing that in practice is obviously a lot of work, right? It's not straightforward, it's not easy, but that's what's got to be done. And so we see, in fact, I see regulators as part of the community as much as anyone else, right? So they are as much part of this whole new DeFi community, and it's kind of mutual collaborative learning. And that creates, a common understanding of where this whole thing is trying to go. And obviously, not everyone is part of it yet, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. A lot of people have very limited understanding, or some people are also, very familiar to working in the old ways, aren't, aware of some of the technology. So it's upon us to work collaboratively with the various regulators and other policy institutions, and that's I think that's a great value add of the DeFi Alliance as well.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear that they are that receptive, and they do also see the opportunities. And I agree, it could be, they might put themselves out of a job eventually if you guys kind of build stuff too well. But that'd be a nice problem to worry about then. So Imran, just conscious of time here. You're live in Europe now. If there's new projects setting up, or people that have already been domiciled in Europe and working on DeFi projects, what do they need to do to get in touch with you, and what can they expect to get from you in terms of mentorship, etc., in the near term?
Yeah, so they can apply at DeFiAlliance.co. There's an apply button on the top right. But in terms of the type of support that we're looking to offer, one is obviously building a community locally and globally is number one. Two is being able to access liquidity. And then, number three is a set of community members from a global perspective to not only help you build your product, but to also integrate. A big part of DeFi is composability. And what best way to build composability other than working with a group of DeFi protocol veterans, such as Aave and others that have been in space for such a long time to bootstrap liquidity and bootstrap product. So I'd say those are the top 3 reasons why you'd want to join the DeFi Alliance.
That's great. Okay, well, look, guys, it's a really great initiative. So I really hope you round up a lot of support, and we'll definitely touch base from time to time to see how things are moving on. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure. Cheers.